We have two commentators who have been listening even more carefully and conscientiously than any of us. Let me introduce them briefly, because they are going to each speak for about 10-15 minutes to give an overview and to make connections, to dot the I's and cross the T's. And that will give a kind of focus and a way of recuperation of all the many things that were said. So the two commentators are Professor Meaghan Morris and Professor Tansen. Professor Meaghan Morris is a well-known scholar on several things connected with popular culture, media, technology, gender, Hong Kong, and she is based in the University of Sydney. And Professor Sen is based in Baruch College, the City University of New York, where he has published a number of works on Buddhism, on Chinese history, and on the connections between China, India, and still ongoing work of most fascinating kind. So what I'm going to do is first give Professor Morris a chance to give us an overview of the talks that we heard today. Once she's finished, we will turn over to Professor Sen, and when they have both finished, the whole discussion is open to you. Now the way this will work is, excellent, efficient team is ready with microphones on either side, and all you have to do is raise a hand. Don't get too agitated. A gentle swaying motion will attract our eye. Something not always easy to notice. You would think, by now we have eyesight and we can notice things in our peripheral vision. But it's amazing when one is intoxicated with what one has to say, how little one notices what's happening. So just sway your hand gently to attract attention, and then I'll make it possible for everyone to get a chance. Now I know, as a vocational interrupter of other people, that one's desire to speak doesn't end. So you have to practice a certain form of self-discipline and expect to say whatever you have to say once only, because there are many people present and everyone would like a chance. The second thing is, please do not, like myself now, offer a long paragraph. Speak in simple, short questions. Do not merely make comments, because the comments leave a respondent nonplussed. So raise your hand, sway gently, and have a question which is brief and pointed after our two commentators.
Thank you. I suspect that we too are the only ones here with no desire to speak at this moment, facing the difficult task of responding to these very rich papers which we have had no opportunity to read. And of course that's what's fun about this. But nevertheless, I'll try to begin by responding to the papers because my co-commentator has stolen the idea of the century. He told me this during the break. Listening to these talks, I don't know about you, but I end up feeling as though I have been walking up a mountain, listening to K-pop through iPods, hidden in our heavy Louis Vuitton handbags, debating the possibilities and limits of place-based culture as we head to what we think will be a great exhibition in this mega museum on the top of the mountain. Only to find, first of all, that it appears to be an iceberg melting, but then, oh no, even worse, it's actually an exhibition. And we are the exhibits, and somewhere out there Zhang Yimou is on a big crane filming the whole thing on the plight of the transnational middle classes early in the 21st century. I actually think this gives us quite a realistic scan of something about contemporary arts culture, with a capital A, that is quite repellent for lots of people around the world. I loved Professor Dwara's slip at the beginning when he was introducing this panel. He said, rethinking the arts. Oops, Rethinking the Asian Century with the Arts. I only realised this morning that really this topic is rethinking the Asian century with the arts. I had mentally translated it as rethinking the arts in the Asian century for quite some time and was completely terrified about addressing this and was completely relieved to find what the real topic is. Now, I do miss Gayatri Spivak not having been here because I can see that she was set to be very severe and to scold us about the whole idea of the Asian century. My colleague from Ari Krishna suggested perhaps I should try to channel Gayatri Spivak. This is beyond me, but I leave this task to you. I simply want to say, on having listened to these talks, that perhaps we do need to think very seriously that the Asian century, for whatever that is worth, is now. Maybe it won't be anything like 100 years. Maybe this is the crest or the peak for middle classes, art consuming and otherwise, because the story that Dr. Ghosh told us, I think, this is the story of the coming times, wherever you are. The environmental period will not be one where regions or nations have the kind of enjoyable dominance that it is possible to narrate some people as having had in the past. I think Ghosh's powerful story really asks us to consider different questions or even to go back to some very old ones. And the one he asked almost in passing that struck me is the idea of the good life. Where does it come from, this idea that the good life involves green grass in semi-arid environments? I know some people at the University of Western Sydney who for several years did a project on water culture. Yes, it was part of this attempt to incrementally modify water usage, but in Australia that's an urgent matter. 2-3 of our cities almost ran out of water in the last drought. And if you're on a 3,000-mile wide island, you cannot bring it over the water. And this water project tried to get serious branches of government to take seriously the possibility that you need to get people to ask why they have to wash their hair 3 times a day, why they need to wash clothes massively. You can go on and describe this model of the good life under that, and we're talking about very ordinary, everyday notions of the good life. This water project failed because nobody is, at the moment, possessing any means to seriously pursue any answers to that are practical. There's no practical means to implement what might come out of it. So here come all the really big questions. And I think if rethinking the Asian century or rethinking the century that humanity faces now with the arts is going to have something to do with asking art whether it can and will, asking critics whether we can and will work to make any difference at all to what people feel a sustainable good life could look like. I think increasingly we'll see the sort of tough critical questions of the past fade in importance compared to these big challenges to our positive imagination. Something that cultural critics trained over the last 50 years are not all that good at. We're really good at showing what is wrong and what is sold out and what is compromised and what is a noble failure in all the thoughts and the arts and the cultural production of our time. I think, and listening to most of these talks, I heard glimmers of hope that we need to do better than that. We need to be able to start generating ideals of the good life that people want to listen to, that people can care for. And the exhibitionary complex, or the exhibitionary imagination, may be one site for that, but I doubt that it's going to be the most important or the most powerful one. And I'll end my response with just a couple of comments on, one on Hong Kong and the good life, and the other about demonstrations and the good life. I've lived in Hong Kong for 12 years, and it was hilarious to enjoy people here laughing at the idea of Singapore rivaling Hong Kong. Of course, in Hong Kong, we laugh at the idea of Hong Kong rivaling Singapore. It's assumed that Singapore is way ahead of the game in all the things that matter. And Hong Kong has been trying very hard, really, to mobilise the mainland to make up for what it perceives as its own deficits. Consequently, as most of you now know, absolutely unsustainable numbers of tourists are crossing that border on a daily basis, something like 5 times the population of the whole city of Hong Kong moves back and forth every 3 months. And severe social difficulties are starting to pull at the seams of an already highly volatile society. This is before West Kowloon. This is while West Kowloon is just a whole lot of mud and digging and a kind of dream and some environmental arguments about the very fast train that will go through to service that museum, which is going to make the trip to Guangzhou all of 12 minutes shorter than the existing train. The gaps between policy proclamations and popular life can be very wide. When you see the quotes on Hong Kong's cultural policy that Peng showed us, I had to smile at the distance between that and the reality of the Hong Kong government's understanding of culture. West Kowloon is being built not very far from one model of the good life in Hong Kong, which is the bustling Nathan Road, the throbbing heart of Cantonese Kowloon. But between the museum complex and the hotels and the shopping malls that are going up and Nathan Road is this giant shopping mall elements, which makes it humanly, physically impossible to get from where the gallery will be at this time over to where life goes on. And in elements, there is a lot of activity. Like every mall in Hong Kong, there's art, there's people, there's bustling, there's family drama being played out in the air conditioning. But right down one end, there is this extraordinary space where the biggest brands are, and if you go in there, there's nobody. There's not even very wealthy mainlanders. There's nobody. It's silent, it's deserted. It's half a mile of the highest end boutiques. And what people pay for on the rare occasions when they do shopping there is just the height of the ceiling, the air conditioning, and the lack of crowd, the lack of human company. That's Hong Kong's iceberg. Things are going, I have 5 minutes? I thought I only had 1. No! I'm building to a peroration. I have 2 sentences to go. Oh my God, you can have the extra minute. Hong Kong, the Hong Kong of popular life that people love is not in that cultural policy. The cultural policy actually aims to replace it and substitute it with various other ways of living, but they're the other ways of living that we already know are unsustainable. So if I'm to look for art's role in the century that's coming, however we name it. I would like to see more leadership, and leadership about good values, the good life, something that we human beings can survive with and continue to gain pleasure and nourishment from. And so I loved hearing today in these papers, again, some little glimpses of this. Obviously, Ben White's story of the demonstration in Singapore speaks to me very directly. This is the kind of rethinking with arts that I can connect to. Wendy and Wan Ling both talk to us in different ways about how place-based culture can speak to or deal with global issues. We already have a lot of writing and thinking about those things, but I think Dr. Ghosh's story today reminds us that it's really time to up the ante on implementing the positive morals and words of encouragement that cultural critics are wont to end their talks with. It's time to do something about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Meaghan, for doing most of my work. Actually, when Gayatri planned to criticize, she planned to criticize both Prasenjit and I because we were the co-organizers. Talking about, if you look at her abstract, she is cautioning the concept of Asia and the century as well. But I think those of you who know the significance of my name might have expected me to sing as a famous singer from 16th century. But I'm going to take you further back to the 8th century, actually. And I'm going to talk about something I've been calling the eternal newness of the Asian century. And there have been several centuries in the past where you do find art playing a major role in connecting Asian societies. And President Dwara has written about Asia Redux. And this is the Dux part of the Redux. And we see from the middle of the 4th to 5th century, major events taking place in Asia, commercial activities from around middle of the 7th to middle of the 8th century, a very important phase as well, from 11th century to 12th century, very important as well. The period that Meaghan covers in his latest books, middle of the 18th to the middle of the 19th century, also very important for Asia. He has talked about paintings on botanical aspects and portrait paintings that are going back and forth. And the century that we are talking about is actually middle of the 20th century to coming of the 21st century. And the words are mid to mid. We don't care of the mid, we just talk about the century. The period that interests me most, and I will try to relate to some of the things that were presented, to this period between the middle of the 7th century to the middle of the 8th century, when you have the Tang Empire in China, you have the Silla Kingdom in Korea, you have the Nara in Japan, you have the Pallavas in South India, you have the Muads in Arabia, you have the Tibetan Empire coming up, and all these regions are connected, interconnected, and there are art forms going back and forth and linking each of these societies, which are learning and transforming them into what is needed by the local regions. So there was another century where arts played a major role, and you can see that with the coming of Islam, and also very importantly the tantric ideas that develop in India that creates various kinds of new art form that moves from India to Java to China to Korea to Japan. And these are quite important ways in which people are interacting with each other, even though the concept of Asia does not exist at that time. But Asia, as we know of today, is linked up. And I'm going to talk about a few issues that relate to many of the talks that perhaps also existed in some ways or form during this period that I'm talking about, between the mid-7th and mid-8th century. The global city of Chang'an, Xi'an, is a cosmopolitan city where people from different parts of Asia are coming. Musicians from Kucha, dancers from Southeast Asia, all these are mixing together in streets, and do you call that pop culture of the mid-8th century? Perhaps, and people have written about it, and if you read the poems of Levi, who himself perhaps comes from Central Asia, his ancestors, cosmopolitan city, yes, if you look at Chang'an. Not only that, if you are comparing Hong Kong and Singapore, the Japanese model their city Nara on Chang'an. So it's something that is transmitted, the concept of a city, to another country. The Silla Kingdom in Korea, established, is this on? No, it's out of battery. If you go back to the 8th century, that happens. No batteries at that time. But the Silla established Confucian Institute there to teach people about Confucian ideas. The Japanese start writing literature, poems in Chinese characters. Something similar happens with literature in southern India. Tansen in Pallavas is writing fictional stories. And these things get transmitted when monks move from one place to another. And then you have Chinese monks going to India, you have Korean monks going to India, and Indian monks going back and forth to China and to Korea and to Japan. But this ideas of art is transmitted as well as Buddhism moves from one place to another. Buddhist art is moving in various directions, not only in one direction, one linear direction, but back and forth. And that produces, very interestingly, maybe a pop culture of vernacular writing in China. What is that? I mean, who does that vernacular literature, writing form, not speaking? Storytelling, 小说, is created in China at this time. Performing arts, one thing is called 编文, transformation text, where pictures are used to tell stories, Chinese more of 18th century, perhaps 8th century, talking about intercultural interactions. And this is not necessarily an Indian thing. It is a mixture of Indian, Chinese, Central Asian things that lead to the development of this kind of literature, certainly of that period. And I think this is very important to understand that this century that we are talking about can be talked about in the earlier periods as well. So Professor Guara is absolutely right, and this is one of the many stages that we are talking about, and art plays a major role. If you look at the tantric art, this is perhaps the most fascinating about how an art form that develops in northern India gradually spreads to Korea and China and Japan, and comes to perhaps helping build Borobudur in Java. And these kinds of ideas are spreading, and with that is the global economy of that period. You have the merchants playing an important role as well. So all these features that seem to exist now seem to have existed between the mid-8th and mid-7th and mid-8th centuries as well. I'll end up with something that Amitav spoke about, and it reminded me of a Chinese poet. Centuries have to end, right? How do centuries end? And what happens? So this is a Chinese poet writing at the beginning of the 9th century, and he's talking about corruption in the Tang government, using the metaphor of desiccated forests, mountains that have lost trees. It reminded me when Amitav was talking about mountain, this story, this poem that he writes, and then it's depicted in paintings of that period. That period has ended in the 9th century. A century perhaps has ended, and what has it resulted into? It has resulted into an economic problem, corruption among the officials, and natural disaster. So it brings back to what Amitav was saying, Asia Redux, as Prasenjit has argued. Thank you.